We're going to end our unit on Descartes by looking at the major problem that people have raised for Descartes' project. And so this isn't a problem with one specific argument or other kinds of problems we've looked at. This is a problem that people have alleged kind of plagues the whole entire project. This problem is called the Cartesian Circle. Right. So this is an argument that Descartes' project, or it's a criticism of Descartes' entire project. All right. So what exactly is this Cartesian circle? Well, it revolves around these three different kinds of things. So what I have up there, the truth rule, this non-deceiving God, the causal principle of ideas, etc. We'll talk about how all those get there in just a second. But the basic idea behind this criticism is that Descartes argues in a circle. That is to say, he assumes the truth of the thing he is trying to prove. He assumes the truth of the thing he is trying to prove. That makes the entire argument bad. You cannot assume the truth of the thing you are trying to prove. Otherwise, there's no need for a proof if you're just going to assume it's true. So, how exactly does this work? Start up at the top of this circle with the truth rule. Right. So and one of the nice things about going through the Cartesian circle is that it helps us understand how the entire project fits together. Right. The Cartesian circle, this problem really starts arising at the beginning of the third meditation when Descartes introduces the truth rule. So let's consider the truth rule, right? The truth rule claims that whatever I vividly and clearly perceive is true. And Descartes wants to establish its truth, right? He wants to establish that the truth rule is true, because if he can do that, well, then he can build up all kinds of things, right? He gets all of mathematics and so on. Okay, fine. But there's a problem. He doesn't know that the truth rule is true. Why? Because there might be a deceiving God. There might be an all-powerful evil being who makes him feel certain when he thinks about whatever, 2 + 2 = 4. This evil God makes Descartes feel certain about that, but it might be the case that, in fact, 2 + 2 = 5, right? It might be the case that the things we vividly and clearly perceive are false, and that the deceiving God is deceiving us about those things. And so what Descartes announces at the beginning of the third meditation is, well, look, it'd be nice to have this truth rule, but we need to validate it. We need to justify it. It's not justified or validated yet. We can't throw it onto our edifice of knowledge quite yet. We need to validate it first. Well, how do we do that? Well, we do that, according to Descartes, by proving first that God exists, and then second, that God is not a deceiver, right? And so that's why the truth rule has this line pointing to the non-deceiving God, because the truth rule is made to rest on there being a non-deceiving God. We can only help ourselves to the truth rule if we can first establish that a non-deceiving God exists. Right? And that's what Descartes proceeds to do in the third meditation. So he extracts the truth rule from the cogito and then goes about isolating the one reason we have for doubting it, namely there might be a deceiving God. And then in the rest of the third meditation, attempts to eliminate that reason for doubt by establishing that a non-deceiving God exists. Okay. Right. And then if we can establish that a non-deceiving God exists, well, then we can help ourselves with the truth rule. But look, Descartes has to give arguments for God's existence, has to give arguments that God is not a deceiver. And those arguments require certain premises. Those conclusions, God exists, God is not a deceiver, rest upon, are derived from certain premises. So, for instance, the argument that God exists crucially rests upon this causal principle of ideas, the CPI, right? That's how Descartes establishes that God exists. Descartes' argument that God is not a deceiver rests upon this premise that deception is an imperfection. And there are other premises besides these, right? So his argument for there being a non-deceiving God, if he can establish that there's a non-deceiving God, that'll get him the truth rule. So in order to get the truth rule, we've got to prove that there's a non-deceiving God. Well, look, in order to prove that there's a non-deceiving God, we need certain premises. And so non-deceiving God has an arrow pointing to causal principle of ideas, etc., because the proof of the non-deceiving God itself rests upon these other claims. The causal principle of ideas, the claim that deception is an imperfection, and so on. Right? And so the truth rule rests on the non-deceiving God. The non-deceiving God rests upon the premises and the arguments for there being a non-deceiving God. Well, that now raises the question, why think the causal principle of ideas is true? Why think that deception is indeed an imperfection? Well, what does Descartes say? In each case, he says that the causal principle of ideas, that the claim that deception is an imperfection, he says these things are known by the natural light. He claims we know the causal principle of ideas by the natural light. That is to say, we intuit it. It's kind of like self-evident. Or, to put it in Descartes' terminology, we vividly and clearly perceive it. To know something by the natural light is to vividly and clearly perceive it. Those are synonyms for Descartes. And so when he says that the causal principle of ideas is known by the natural light, he is saying that that we vividly and clearly perceive the causal principle of ideas. And so in claiming that the causal principle of ideas is true, which he must be since he's using it in an argument for the non-deceiving God, by claiming that the causal principle of ideas is true because we know it by the natural light, Descartes is assuming the truth rule. He's assuming that whatever he vividly and clearly perceives is true, right? He's assuming that the truth rule is true in his proof of the truth rule. The only reason to accept the causal principle of ideas and these other premises that Descartes gives us, the only reason he gives us to accept these things is that they are vividly and clearly perceived. But vivid and clear perception, whether or not it is truthful, whether or not it's reliable, is precisely what's at issue. And so, in trying to establish that it is truthful, that it is reliable, you can't assume that it is truthful and reliable. But that is exactly what Descartes does. He assumes that anything he knows by the natural light will be true. But that's precisely what he's trying to establish. He assumes that anything he vividly and clearly perceives is true. But that's precisely what he's trying to establish. That's precisely what the truth rule claims. And it's the truth rule that has been cast into doubt. And so Descartes is committing a fallacy, namely begging the question. Another way of referring to that is arguing in a circle. That's why people call this the Cartesian Circle. So Descartes argues in a circle. He assumes the truth of the thing that he is arguing for. He is trying to argue for the truth rule, and in the course of that argument, he assumes that it's true already. That's a bad argument. That's assuming the truth of your conclusion in the course of your argument. That's begging the question or arguing in a circle. right? To give you a very simple example of why this is a bad kind of argument. Let's say I were trying to convince you that I have a blue pen on my desk, right? I'm going to give you an argument for that claim. Well, how would that go? Well, here's a bad way that that would go. If I said, well, look, I have a blue pen on my desk. Why should you believe that? Because I have a blue pen on my desk. If you weren't convinced that I have a blue pen on my desk in the first place, and thus were asking for an argument for it, if I were to simply assert that conclusion as a premise, that's not going to be any more convincing, right? I haven't given you any new information to establish that claim. I'm assuming that the thing that you are questioning, that you want an explanation of, I'm assuming already that it's true. The thing that you have called into doubt, the thing that you're not sure of, and trying to make you sure of it, I just assert it again. I just assume that it's true again. Well, if you weren't sure about it in the first place, the argument I give you is not going to make you sure of it. Same thing then with Descartes' project of trying to validate the truth rule. Now, one of the upshots of this that people have tried to highlight is that the reason that Descartes gets into such trouble is because he makes things so difficult for himself. He subjects himself to the worst kind of skepticism you could possibly imagine. That there is an all-powerful deceiver. And Descartes thinks that he can kind of get around this kind of skepticism. But what people who have pressed this Cartesian Circle criticism have said is that if you have such a strong skeptical hypothesis, there is no way to get around it. If there is a deceiving God, well, yeah, we won't know anything. And so the problem that Descartes runs into ultimately is that he is too hung up on certainty. Descartes introduces the most severe kind of skeptical hypothesis he can think of. Why? Because he wants foundations that are absolutely certain, that couldn't possibly be false. If, however, Descartes were to relax a bit on that requirement, then all of these problems could be avoided, because then he wouldn't need to go to the most extreme kind of skepticism, right? If he were willing to accept things that were just really probably in all likelihood true, 99% certain that they're true, well, then he wouldn't have to if that would have met the bar, so to speak, for Descartes, well, then he wouldn't have had to introduce the worst kind of skeptical hypothesis he could think of. And that wouldn't then get him involved in arguing in a circle. So that's one upshot of this criticism. But as it stands, Descartes insists upon certainty, and so he introduces the deceiving God hypothesis, and so he runs into this very significant problem, the Cartesian circle. Now, last thing I want to talk about is kind of Descartes' place with regard to these areas of philosophy, right? So we've looked at Plato and Aristotle, and now we've finished our unit on Descartes. We've seen for Plato and Aristotle various metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical views. And what we've seen in Plato and Aristotle is that their views are systematic. Their views about metaphysics tie into their views about epistemology, which tie into their views about ethics, which tie into their views about metaphysics, and so on. They give systematic views of things, right? Descartes gives a very different view. Sure, he talks about metaphysics, he talks about substance dualism and God. But the reason, and I think this is particularly clear in the case of God, the reason he gets into these metaphysical issues is because of his epistemology. Descartes is primarily an epistemologist. The reason he introduces God into his meditations is simply to get this divine guarantee. God is introduced to help establish the truth rule. Substance dualism is introduced as a kind of tangent. It's not really related to the main line of argument. And so Descartes wades into metaphysics either as a kind of tangent, substance dualism, or for epistemological reasons, God, right? Descartes has virtually nothing to say about ethics, nothing in the meditations, at least. In some private letters that he wrote to some people, he'll kind of dabble in ethics, but he didn't really write anything about ethics. And so, in contrast to Plato and Aristotle, who gave these systematic views about metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, thinking all of them important, Descartes is really just an epistemologist. And he dabbles in these other areas for epistemological reasons. And so Descartes really puts philosophy on a different kind of track. Epistemology becomes the primary philosophical enterprise following Descartes. Whereas prior to Descartes, within the intellectual tradition inaugurated by Plato and Aristotle, you had this much more holistic view, much more holistic, systematic view of philosophy.